Russia and Ukraine. An ultimatum has now been given. Now, ordinarily, you would think, well, that must be the Russians have given an ultimatum to the Ukraine side, because what else would make any sense? But of course, in this war, what does make sense? And actually, it looks like it's the other way around. It looks like Ukraine is not only given an ultimatum, not to Russia, though, to NATO. Ukraine, for one of their, I guess their new foreign minister, has issued an ultimatum that says they will be given full membership application to NATO, because nothing else would make any sense. We'll try to make sense of something that doesn't make a lot of sense with Alexander Mercouris of the Duran, one of our favorite guests and one of the most delightful people I've ever met. I had the privilege of meeting you and your lovely wife in London not too long ago, and always a delight to have you on the show.
Absolute delight to be here, and a wonderful meeting we had in London, just to say, and looking forward to our next meeting, and always looking forward to being on this show.
Indeed, we're looking forward to that as well, my wife and I. But before we get to the pleasantries, we have to get to the insanities. And I mean, we'll just start with this. Listen, I'm gonna take you on a wild ride as we go through the show today. This seemingly back and forth have been two competing views of versions of what is reality, and it's going to be hard to make some sense out of it. But I hope I don't give you any whiplash in the neck. So apologies if that happens. But let's start off with Kiev first of all, because they have told NATO. Gary, if you can toss that one headline up there. Oh, you already have it. So he has said basically that anything less than full NATO membership will not stop Russia, and that full NATO membership will stop Russia. Now, we're closing in on the third year mark of this war. Can you give me any kind of rational basis why they would make such a statement at this hour?
Well, there is no rational basis, but let's try and understand what they're trying to do. They want to get into NATO. They're going to say that NATO membership is going to stop the Russians. It's not going to stop the Russians. It's going to provoke the Russians. The Russians have made NATO membership for Ukraine an absolute red line. They've said that, well, one of the key reasons why they started the special military operation was precisely because they were afraid that Ukraine was going to enter NATO. So if NATO were to come along and say that Ukraine is indeed entering NATO, that incentivizes the Russians not only to continue the war, but perhaps even to escalate it. So what the Ukrainians are trying to do, and this is the only way they understand now that they can win, and of course they have a very maximalist conception of what victory means. But the only way they can win, the only way they can achieve their goals is by involving NATO in the war. And this ultimately is what this is all about.
But see, even that it seems to be incongruous with reality, because if NATO did come in on their side, then almost certainly this would then escalate into nuclear conflict. Ergo, nobody would win. So no matter whether NATO is involved or not, it seems to me that there is no rational path on any capacity, even if they got what they wanted, to actually win. Does that thought process not operate in Kiev?
You see, the trouble is, first of all, you're absolutely right. I said NATO membership for Ukraine will be seen by Russia as an existential matter. In fact, Putin has been talking today about the war in Ukraine. He said that strategic defeat for Russia in Ukraine would be an existential matter for Russia. It would mean, in effect, the end of Russia as an independent sovereign state. And this is something he cannot allow, and the Russia cannot allow. And NATO membership for Ukraine would amount to a strategic defeat for Russia. So you're absolutely right. It's not going to end the war. NATO getting involved, inevitably, it is going to lead to an armed clash between Russia and NATO. And it's impossible for me to see, given the stakes, how that can be brought under control. It would probably take us all the way up. Well, it could very easily. It would quite probably take us all the way up into a world war scenario. The trouble is, though this is so clear to me and to you and to all rational people. In Kiev, they're becoming very desperate, and this is not being explained to them properly. They continue to be told by NATO, by Western officials, by American officials and the Biden government that yes, your future is in NATO. One day you will be in NATO. All you have to do is wait a little longer and you will end up there. Instead of being told straightforwardly and simply, I'm sorry, this is not on the agenda. It's not going to happen. You have to accept that. Instead of them being told that, they're still being led to think that one day NATO membership will be offered to them, and that makes them think that they can get it now.
Well, I mean, there's some plausibility to that, and who's fed that fuel any more than NATO at this past summer in July at the NATO summit, at the Washington summit, where they expressly said precisely that it is inevitable that they will eventually be into NATO, which of course is received by the Ukrainian side as being something hopeful and optimistic, and by the Russian side as being, this is why we keep fighting. So it continues to work at cross purposes. And then you also have, maybe indirectly, from you mentioned some of the Western leaders will pick on your Prime Minister Keir Starmer as one. He's implying that maybe that is a good idea because Ukraine can't be allowed to lose for our sake.
It's right that we support Ukraine, but we must be clear that it's also deeply in our own self-interest to do so. I'd encourage everyone here to stop and think for a moment what it would mean to us, to our continent, to the world, if Russia wins. What would it mean for our values, for democracy, commerce, and liberty? It means they are weakened. It means that other autocrats would believe they could follow in Putin's example. And it means that our security, stability, and prosperity would be damaged. The further Russian troops advance, the closer the threat becomes. The more land they control, the more they control grain prices and energy sources, and the more confident Putin becomes.
Is that true though? Let's just look at the substance of what he said there, that it's in UK's interest to make sure that Russia loses, because if Putin wins, then your economics future will be at risk, your security itself, your liberty. I mean, just goodness gracious, apparently the whole Western world will fall apart if Russia wins. How do you see that?
Well, I mean, the Russians were within both of our living memories, were on the Elbe River in central Germany, a lot further west than they are now, and a lot further west than they are going to be, heading. And it didn't result in this catastrophe for the Western world that Starmer is saying. It didn't mean the end of Britain. It didn't mean the end of the United States. It didn't mean the collapse of international relations. Of course, I do not want to see the Russians move back to the Elbe River. I don't think anybody in Russia wants Russia to go back to the Elbe River. I think that the thing to do is to find a solution to achieve peace in Ukraine. That is the true, proper way to safeguard all the things that Starmer is talking about. Endless war, constant support for a losing conflict, all that is going to do, put aside all the nonsense about, the whole Western world, the entire international system crashing down. Think about Ukraine itself. Think about the Ukrainian people. Prolonging the war, all that is going to do is going to inflict even more suffering, even more loss, even more disaster on Ukraine itself. It is a debating point. It's a bad debating point. I've said in previous programs, British politicians are addicted to debating, and it's very much the debating style to try to expand the discussion by making, wide, extreme claims like this, that the whole future of humanity depends on pushing back and winning some kind of victory in Ukraine. All it is doing is it's taking us away from the reality, which is that there is a disaster underway in Ukraine now, and the Ukrainian people are its primary victims.
Well, now perhaps you could help me understand further. It's one thing to have a debate. It's one thing to have an aspirational discussion about what you would actually like to have, and then you also have to have the practical fundamentals on the ground. Has to comport with what you're saying, or it would seem to be kind of weird, if I can be charitable. Yet in that same speech, Keir Starmer goes on to say that we are going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. I thought that had fallen out of the lexicon. He resurrects it here just yesterday, but then he adds this odd thing about negotiations, and we'll talk this on the backside.
So we must continue to back Ukraine and do what it takes to support their self-defense for as long as it takes, to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position for negotiations so that they can secure a just and lasting peace on their terms that guarantees their security, independence, and the right to choose their future.
Okay, so we'll just take two very brief examples. 2023, the entire calendar year, Ukraine prepared for and then utterly failed at an offensive operation to try to drive Russia out. Since about October, November of 2023 to current date, it has been nothing but a methodical, nonstop Russian advance to the west, and even a little bit in the north now after the shrinking down the Kursk operation. So everything that you've seen, Ukraine is going further and further down. And then Starmer, first of all, they never said anything about a negotiated settlement. It has always been as long as it takes until they win. And now it's like, well, as long as it takes to get a good deal in their favor. What kind of mentality says that they think that there's any possibility that a negotiated settlement would be done when Russia has all the advantages? How does that work?
Well, it doesn't work. I mean, this is the other problem, and I think you put your finger on it. This whole thing is completely unrealistic. It has no reality behind it at all. It completely ignores the realities and the capabilities. The Russians are far more powerful. They are on the offensive. They're getting more powerful every day. They're getting better at war every day. I mean, that's a thing that I think you've discussed better than anyone else, actually. I mean, the Russian army is much more experienced and proficient in war than it was when this war started. And we can't realistically slow them down or stop them. If we could, we would have done so. The Biden administration has given enormous numbers of weapons to Ukraine. The Europeans have done the same. Britain has also, and it's not managed to stop the Russians. It's slowed them down to some degree, but it's never going to turn the situation around. What Starmer is talking about going on to support Ukraine until Ukraine is in an advantageous position where it can in effect dictate terms, is something that's never going to happen. Ukraine is never going to be in a position where it dictates terms. What this is a formula for is continued sending of weapons to Ukraine so that Ukraine can lose more completely. Now, it's astonishing that 3 years into the war, there are still people in the West, like my prime minister, who don't seem to understand that.
Well, and unfortunately, it's not limited to just to Keir Starmer. I almost wish that it was. But here is earlier today, just I think a couple of hours ago, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was talking about what the future is for the Russia-Ukraine war. And it's just as much of a head scratcher.
Ukraine is entering another crucial winter. And Russia's aggression shows no sign of abating. Just the opposite. Putin is ramping up his rhetoric and reckless actions. He is using Ukraine as a testing ground for experimental missiles and is deploying North Korean soldiers in this illegal war. Putin is not interested in peace. He is pressing on, trying to take more territory. because he thinks he can break Ukraine's resolve and ours. But he is wrong. Ukraine has a right to defend itself, and we have a duty to help them. So we need to continue our steadfast support.
So he's literally, he just continued on with exactly, I'm just not going to look at anything on the ground. And, and he says they're not going to break our resolve in the West. There he may be accurate, because quite frankly, it doesn't cost us anything. It makes money for us. We get to spend money on these weapons and all this kind of stuff. It gets to harm Russia, except that it's not our people who are paying the price that you mentioned at the top of the show here, the Ukrainian people who were getting crushed, killed in large numbers, wounded in even larger numbers, territory, cities being smashed, etc. We keep going with that. It seemed to not have a problem with it.
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned that, because that is the absolutely important thing to understand. All this brave and heroic rhetoric, all of this posing, because that's what it is being done at the expense of the Ukrainians. We're not fighting. We're not putting ourselves at risk. Nobody, I think, in any Western country seriously believes that we're in any real danger. If we did feel we were in actual danger, we would be responding to this crisis. Our governments would be responding to this crisis in a totally different way. So we engage in this rhetoric, and at the same time, we give the Ukrainians all kinds of false hopes and encouragement, because we can, without any real thought or concern for what in the meantime happens to them. We've been in effect obstructing negotiations, because that's what we have been doing. When there was an actual deal almost on the table in April 2022, signed off in Istanbul, we told the Ukrainians, walk away from it. We'll give you all that you need. We will help you win. A completely impossible promise, as things have proved. And we haven't changed. We haven't changed our outlook. We haven't changed our thinking. We are being brave and heroic at the expense of the Ukrainians. And it is one of the most shameful episodes that I can think of in the modern history of the West, and certainly of the European powers.
Which is saying a lot. And I want to focus in just a little bit. I told you we're going to kind of go back and forth here. So there's all these positive, optimistic statements by some Western leaders, but let's look a little bit more on the ground at the reality of it. And in addition to the things that I just mentioned a second ago about the 2023 and the offensive in Russia so far ongoing in 2024, you also have to look at just the fundamentals that are still at play. Russia has millions more men from which to draw. Their armed forces are probably close to triple the size active right now from the Ukraine side are, and there's plenty of people left to add to that even further. Of course, the Russian have air power. The Ukraine sides have almost none, virtually none, just sorties here and there. Air defense, of course, is decisively on the Russian side. And one of the bigger ones is the defense industrial base is for Russia is just cranking out on all cylinders, and it's anemic on the Ukraine side. And the Russian allies in North Korea and in Iran are providing decisive outcome. By itself, we could just stop right there. But now then you look at the impact this is having on the Ukrainian side. There has been recent information out that 100,000 Ukrainians have deserted their army. That is just a monumental number. I think the British Army itself is 168,000. So that's basically more than half of the UK Army has deserted Ukraine. And of course, that's on top of all of the losses that they've had and the people that they keep trying to throw into uniforms and pull them off the battlefields. Now they're thinking about taking another generation, 18-year-olds, possibly even bringing them into it. You just throw more blood into the abyss, really, for that. The BBC is actually reporting, I think it was this morning, or maybe it was yesterday, what's going on with the Ukraine side in the Kursk area. Now, we've talked before that's what happened when in August, when Ukraine wanted to put pressure on Russia, whatever, some ridiculous thing. It never had any chance for success, but they kept them there. They never withdrew them. And so the BBC says, hey, they've been talking to some people directly in there. And some of the key things from this article here, it says that the message that we have received have been almost uniformly bleak. They said it makes sense that, a lot of people want to complain that you don't have enough stuff. That's not unusual. But what is unusual, apparently, in contrast or context that they've been talking to these people, is that they're uniformly bleak. And then the orders that they said were to hang on until this small sliver of Russian territory, until a new U.S. president with new policies arrives. And I just got to think, from a military perspective, from a humanitarian perspective, what in the world would they want to do that? Why would Ukraine give them this instructions to just hang on to a piece of territory that has no value to their country, that will result in continuous, just ridiculous losses, when the Trump administration is already saying they're going to come in and try to negotiate something? I just don't understand it. But this just shows you the mentality of the Ukrainian troops, and they have to be losing context in their leadership.
Well, absolutely. And that takes me back to Starmer and Rutte and all of these people, because the thing that is coming through now very, very clearly is that the Ukrainian people themselves, including the soldiers of the Ukrainian army, are now increasingly wanting to see peace, that they are exhausted by the war. In fact, I did read that BBC article, and it was extremely sad reading. I mean, the soldiers there, as you said, they feel bleak. They're bitter. They are questioning increasingly the logic of the whole Kursk operation. And when they get orders, which, by the way, I simply don't understand. I mean, why cling on to what some of the people would, in that article, were referring to as forests, basically empty forests, because another country far away, the United States, is going to change president in January. I mean, obviously, I'm overstating things. I mean, the United States does have a big impact on the war in Ukraine, but this cannot be a sensible military decision. And the soldiers know it. They don't understand the logic and the sense of doing this thing. And the Ukrainian military, the people who are fighting, they are becoming very tired. They're becoming very demoralized. They know that they're losing the war. They're saying so. And they want negotiations, and they want peace. And it makes one again feel that people like Rutte and Starmer talking in this way about as long as it takes and putting Ukraine in the advantageous position ahead of negotiations so that it's able to dictate terms are not only out of tune with reality, but are now completely out of tune with the sentiments of people in Ukraine itself.
And it's ironic. I'm going to show you something here from the Institute for the Study of War, which I often say here on this channel. They have great maps, but terrible analysis. But even this decidedly pro-Ukrainian forces, this is from their today's report. Some of the key takeaways: prominent voices in the Russian information space continue to emphasize that Russian President Vladimir Putin is uninterested in a negotiated settlement of the war, and that the result's anything less than a total Ukrainian capitulation. That's not the government. That's in a lot of the Russian information spaces. But that does reflect a lot of the thinking in Russia. But you can certainly understand why Putin, though he continues, along with Lavrov, to say, yes, we're interested in negotiations. We're still willing to do that. I think Lavrov said it as recently as yesterday. But the terms are rather different than what the likes of Keir Starmer are saying. And then you continue to look on down this, and everywhere you want to look, the Russian side continues to advance. The Russian military command is focusing on training additional Russian forces, improving their tactical operations. I mean, literally everywhere you want to look, things are getting better. And this is from somebody, again, who's decidedly pro-Ukrainian. So you would think then that others in the United States are going, okay, Here comes this new administration. They're completely, of the side that are not going to do the Biden as long as it takes thing. They're talking about negotiated settlements, etc. The ISW has admitted that things are continuing to go in the Russia's favor on the ground. So let's just say, all right, let's start going down that path. But instead, so I picked on your country for a minute. Now let me pick on mine. Here's what General Hertling, former commander of the U.S. 1st Armored Division, had to say about Putin, and it seems to be out of context with what we just read.
But Russia's military is in disarray. They are spread across a bunch of continents, not just Syria and Ukraine. Their economy is in free fall, as Fred just mentioned. They face some threats on several fronts and decreased assistance from a bunch of allies that are having problems themselves. So we're seeing, as calm as Putin is and as his spokesman may appear to be, they don't have reason to feel very good about what's going on. They're facing dynamics on every single one of their fronts, which could cause increasing problems. Putin is not in a good place right now. And I hope that, based on our approach toward the Ukrainian war, we take advantage of that.
So what say you about what advantage do you think we should take of Putin is not in a good place right now?
Well, I think this is so completely unrealistic. It is so completely disconnected from reality that it's difficult to know where to start. I mean, the ISW says that the Russian army is advancing, which they clearly are. The NATO is saying that Russian arms production is increasing, which it clearly is. The Russian economy is continuing to grow. I was looking at some economic statistics from Russia this morning. They have high inflation, as exists in many countries. In Russia, it is higher than in some countries, but that is very typical of what you find in countries at war. That is nothing unusual, and it is nonetheless, despite the fact that it's higher than they want it to be, it is still under control. Their political alliances and friendships around the world remain solid. Putin, about 6 weeks ago, presided over a huge summit in Kazan in central Russia, where the BRICS leaders and about 20 other leaders and government officials turned up, and all sorts of other countries turned up. He visits China. He's going to India very soon. He spoke this morning to Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey. There is absolutely no reality to what we have just heard. As I said, even the ISW admits that from a military point of view, the Russians are continuing to advance. Now, one thing I do have to say about the ISW analysis, it says that in the Russian information space, people are saying that Putin is not interested in any negotiations that do not result in Ukraine's total capitulation. Well, I don't know what everybody in the Russian information space is saying, but I do read pretty much everything on Ukraine that Putin ever says. And he has never said anything like that. He has always said that he is open to negotiations, that he's prepared to sit down and talk. He has set out conditions in June, which are tough, but they are not such that I would describe them as Ukraine's total capitulation. And I am sure that if there was a negotiation, a serious negotiation underway, well, quite plausibly, because Putin and Russia have a wider, larger world to think about, I suspect that they would probably agree to soften on some things and agree to compromises on others, and we might find a way to a negotiation. I find comments like that, which misrepresent Putin's publicly stated position, what they do, and what I think they're intended to do, is to deter us from doing what we should be doing, which is reaching out not just to Putin, but to the Russians, and to finding out what their actual stand is, what their real positions are, so that we can talk to them and perhaps find a way through the problems that we face now. So just to say, I think the ISW on that is wrong. And as for the general, I didn't catch his name, General Hurting or something like
Certainly.
that. I think he is completely wrong. I mean, I think that he is living in a fantasy land. I think wishful thinking has completely taken him over.
Yeah.
That's all I can say.
And you, of course, you know, I mean, that's CNN, that's mainstream media. All these places are mainstream media where they're talking about this stuff. And so that's what the majority of Americans, because they don't, now more people are moving into alternative and you know, shows like yours and shows like what we're doing here. A lot of people are going to that, but raw numbers are still quite large for these other places here. And so people listen to that and they go, oh, okay, cool. Well then, yeah, sure. Let's keep going. Now, as I mentioned, Trump has come in. He has said he's going to have a negotiated settlement. He has recently assigned General Kellogg, a guy who was the national security advisor for the vice president in the first Trump administration, as his Ukrainian envoy. And so he's been making a lot of noise about in news, et cetera, about this Kellogg plan, about how he thinks they should negotiate. Well, he was on Fox News, I think it was yesterday, talking about the situation where, okay, if Trump comes in and says he's going to have a negotiated settlement, then why, after the election, did the Biden administration allow long-range weapons, which could potentially expand it? And is he flooding the zone, this big surge, according to the National Security Advisor? We're going to send billions of dollars in the remaining 5 or 6 weeks before the Trump takes over. Some people were saying, well, he's undermining what Trump's going to do. But Kellogg went on television and had this interesting take on it.
In a way, it's really pretty good for the president-elect because it gives him leverage. He can make the decision of what he wants to do. And the more that the Biden administration does this, it creates a greater opportunity for the president-elect to do what he wants to do. And again, he understands leverage probably better than anybody based on his business experience. But, you know, go back to September when Zelensky came to Trump Tower and he went up there and then he and the president spoke and they were talking about after 1,000 days of war, they're signaling it's time for this war to end because the president said very clearly, and it's a quote, it is time. And he's right about that. This war's gone on for over 1,000 days. It's expanded. It's now global in nature. When I mean global in nature, when you look at what's happened, you've got the North Koreans involved by providing troops, you've got the Iranians involved, you've got the Chinese involved, and you've got the Russians involved. So the makeup of the war has expanded, and it's time we kind of put it back in a box, not only for American security, but for global security as well. Yeah. So I don't have a problem with what they've done. It's all based on leverage. The president understands that, and he's going to use it to his advantage.
I'm sorry, I had to put that comment up on the screen there, that any kind of relation in real world to something that happened to Colonel Klink on Hogan Zeros. I just felt embarrassing, but also funny. So I had to put that up there because there is some justification in it. On the terms of what Kellogg's saying, he seems to think that he can come in and that President Trump, because of his reputation, has leverage where he can compel Russia into certain directions here. How do you see that aspect of it?
I think, again, this is completely wrong. The Biden administration has been trying to find leverage, that kind of leverage, over the Russians for 3 years, and they haven't. They've launched a couple of missiles at Russia. That's not given the United States, Donald Trump, leverage over the Russians. It has infuriated the Russians. It has demonstrated that they have capabilities which no one imagined that they had, at least no one that, I'm aware of. Maybe people in the intelligence world.
It had never been demonstrated in combat.
It had never been demonstrated in combat. And we now know that it exists. And that is a worrying thing. So if anything, it's given them leverage, I would have said, on that more than it's given us, because the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows are a known capability, and this wasn't. So I just don't see what he means. I mean, giving more weapons to Ukraine. We've given piles of weapons to Ukraine. We've depleted our arsenals to Ukraine. I'm going to say something else. There's 2 things I want to say. There were 3 things I want to say about Kellogg. Firstly, I actually welcome his appointment. I think the fact that we have an envoy, somebody who is prepared to go out there or has been appointed to go out there and talk to the Russians, whatever misconceptions and errors and things of that kind that he has, I think that is a good thing. I hope Kellogg, who impresses me as an intelligent man, will actually go to Moscow, listen to what Putin says. I presume she's going to meet Putin, listen to what Lavrov and all the others have to say, and will develop and evolve his views. The second is that I actually read recently, or rather reread recently, his report, the report that he wrote with, I think, Fred Feitz back in April. And it's a curate's egg, as we say in England. It's got some good things, lots of bad things, lots of things that are wrong. But it does seem to understand that taking Putin seriously, respecting him as a leader, understanding that the Russians have legitimate security concerns, talking about the issue of NATO, which is of such concern to the Russians, it does seem to realize that you can't get past first base unless you do those things. The third thing I want to say, and I really do want to make this clear, and I would like to think that there are people in the administration listening to this, which is that I have been involved in business negotiations many times in my life. I was a mediator. I acted as a broker in negotiations. Put aside this idea, very dangerous idea, that negotiations in a business environment are the same as international diplomacy. There are some points of overlap, but profoundly, they are completely different. For one thing, in a diplomatic setting, you have to understand that the other party is going to be there all the time. It's not like in a business setting where you meet, you do the deal, you move on. The Russians are going to be there all the time. They're going to be there 24/7, every week in the year. You're going to have to deal with them constantly. So you mustn't assume that you can gain leverage over them in the way that happens in business negotiations, or indeed in legal negotiations. In diplomacy, it doesn't work like that.
Well, that's a very interesting aspect, interesting thing to look at here, which I doubt very seriously we get at this level. I want to now jump back across the pond to your side there, to where, speaking of negotiations, Michael Clark, was interviewed on Sky News. I think it was today, where he was asked about some of the possible outcomes of some of these negotiations. And he had what I considered a really curious conclusion. I'll leave it at that, and we'll pick it up on the backside.
The ceasefire line, on the line of contact at the moment in Ukraine, say from north to south, that's 600 miles, about 1,000 kilometers. So if you want to have a demilitarized zone of, let's guess, 15 miles or 20 kilometers either side of that line, who's going to be there? I mean, which troops? UN forces, NATO forces? It can't be NATO forces, almost certainly not, but it might be European forces or Western forces. And so a line of neutral troops, and the idea of being maybe European troops, not under NATO's banner, but individually, as it were, let's say a brigade of British troops, a brigade of German troops, a brigade of French troops or whatever. And they would sit along that line and dare the Russians to attack them.
Wait. Dare the Russians to attack them? Well, how does that work? And he said neutral troops, and he specifically mentioned UK and German and French troops, and French and British troops are allowing Storm Shadows and Scalp and et cetera to be fired into Russia. So I'm not sure that would be neutral, but can you think of any scenario where Russia would ever, in the current situation, agree to any kind of a negotiation that left NATO troops under whatever name in between the two sides?
No, of course not. I mean, this is exactly why the war began. It was in order to prevent NATO troops entering Ukraine. Absolutely, under whatever banner you choose to, they choose to come under. There's no way the Russians are going to accept this. There's no conceivable situation where they will allow Western forces, let's call them Western forces, to enter and establish themselves and take up positions in Ukraine. I mean,
Alexander, this is on Sky News. This is not just some fringe person here. And of course, I'm watching it, and the guy, the anchor there, never pushed back on any of this stuff. But I mean, this stuff immediately should leap out. and Clark is not some minor figure either. I mean, he's sometimes actually gives good advice. I've seen sometimes. We've had him on our show once. But I mean, that is so far from anything that's reality. I just don't get how it works.
Well, you see, the fundamental problem is that a lot of these discussions take place and people don't take the time to think through what the Russian position is, because they fundamentally don't consider that the Russians are entitled to have a position. As far as they're concerned, the Russians have committed a war of aggression against Ukraine. This is a territorial land grab. It's intended to subjugate the whole of Ukraine. When the Russians talk about security interests, about their concerns about NATO, about all of those things, people like Michael Clark, intelligent man though he unquestionably is, just don't take that seriously. And that is the error. That is where it goes fundamentally wrong. In any conflict, this, by the way, also applies to business conflicts or legal conflicts. In any type of conflict, you have to understand your adversary. You have to understand what your adversary is thinking, what their objectives are, so that you can work out your response, not just thinking of your own objective, but taking into account what their objectives are also. And of course, in the West, we never do that because Putin is reduced to a cartoon figure. The Russians are just aggressive. They just want to conquer Ukraine and march on to Britain and do all of the things that Keir Starmer was talking about. We never actually sit down and ask ourselves, what exactly is it that the Russians say they want?
Yeah, and of course, if you don't do that, then it's just, I mean, how can anyone reach any kind of a negotiated settlement that's to your advantage even, or that gives you some benefits that you want if you don't understand? Well, I don't need to tell you all that stuff. One more thing I want to talk about here that's, I think, unintentionally illuminating. So I mentioned a minute ago that the Biden administration right now is trying to just shove, I think, $6 to $8 billion more stuff out the door before they change power here on 20 January. And I think the Germans have also get a couple of packages out. UK may also have in the last few weeks or so. But this is all like the tag end of a big package that the U.S. signed, $61 billion package this past May, which was allegedly going to change the context of the war. They'd been waiting for that. That was why they had not done well up to that point. And of course, as we know, since that time, since they got that money, the losses have accelerated dramatically on the Ukraine side. That's something that needs to be talked about here. But I'm going to play you a one clip from Volodymyr Zelensky in the now famous Sky News interview of just a few days back, where he was talking to the interview about quite a number of things. And in it, he's going to be talking about the equipping of 10 brigades. And notice the time frame he's talking about here, because it really has a lot to do with this, with when they got this money. Watch this.
So they speak about mobilization, but the real problem with 10 brigades, which our partners didn't equip. I asked them very much, more than 1 year ago, that we need to equip these brigades. We made this solution with United States and with European allies, and for today, totally Europe and the United States totally now equipping 2.5 brigades.
Okay.
For today.
So have they abandoned you then? Why aren't they giving you more weapons?
I don't have. I mean, this is their decision. There are some bureaucracy, some decisions, some they don't think that this is the priority, and etc. It's always the same way during this war.
Okay, so he's claiming that for a year he's been trying to get equipment sets for 10 brigades, and as of now he's got 2.5. And that's for a year. So we gave them $61 billion in May. They're trying to shove another $6 to $8 billion out the door today. But he's telling you that I still have 7.5 brigades that are not equipped. So upon what leverage does anyone in the West think that the Ukraine side is going to have when I assure you there is no such shortage of equipment, ammunition, anything else on the Russian side?
Well, this is exactly it. I mean, yeah, that is exactly the point. I mean, by Zelensky's own admission, he is critically short of weapons. There are lots of articles now that appear all across the media in the West and Ukraine itself, by the way, about the fact that Ukraine is now critically short of men as well. So given that this is so, this is not going to reverse tomorrow. It's not going to reverse next month or next year. It cannot reverse because Zelensky was asked, why aren't they giving you these weapons? It's because there are inevitably always limitations on capacity, a fact which Starmer, Rutte, all of these other people never ever acknowledge, which is another problem, by the way. So we can't just reverse this situation. The Russians are able to produce weapons at a vast scale, not just because they have a strong industrial base, which they do, stronger at least than we ever told ourselves that they had, but because for them, this is a critically important war. It's about something that Russian society cares collectively about, and they're prepared to make sacrifices over, even if that means experiencing higher prices and those sort of things. If $61 billion is what we can provide, which was what we provided in May, it didn't change the situation then. $725 million, which is what you've just shown me, isn't going to change the situation now. And if there were huge numbers of weapons that we had in abundance that we could send to Ukraine that would turn the situation and re-equip all those brigades that Zelensky is talking about and change the situation on the front lines, we would have done it. If we haven't done it now, the reality is that we never will.
We can't. And so then that kind of leaves us trying to make sense of all these contradictory statements that people are just shooting past each other and kind of in the middle. And I haven't talked much about the Russian side itself, but you have the realities on the ground where they're continuing to methodically and actually increase the pace of their territorial conquest. They're increasing the pace of the Ukrainian losses, both in the north, in the Kharkiv area, in the Kursk area, and then all along the line of contact, especially in the Pokrovsk area and in the south, that continues to move forward. There is no rational path where that's going to stop at any point. And so if we continue on with fiction and not taking into consideration what the Russian side is even trying to do, the Russian side, by all rational thought, would say, okay, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing here. Whether they ever come up with a big arrow movement, so to speak, and there's many reports that they have literally hundreds of thousands of troops not in contact, and they could flood a zone somewhere should they decide to do it. But even if they don't, even if they stay with what they're doing, it is inevitable that at some point you're literally just going to crush and grind to dust and this thing collapse. So where do we go from here if we think we're going to a negotiated settlement that benefits Kiev, and then the Russians just keep doing what they're doing? Where's this going?
Well, first of all, your analysis, your description of the situation is absolutely spot on. I'm not going to add to it because if I do, then we're just going over the same ground again. But you're absolutely right. The Russians hold the military strategic initiative over the war in Ukraine. So that means that we cannot hope to achieve peace by seeking to dictate terms to them. We must put that idea to one side completely. But we can talk to them about Ukraine. The Russians do have long-term concerns about Ukraine. They've set out what their own security interests are, but they have not, for themselves, fully defined what total victory in Ukraine would mean. And there are, I know, concerns in Russia that they risk becoming overextended in Ukraine, that they risk ending up in places that they're not wanted, they really are not wanted, and that this could be a long-term problem for them. Also, the Russians undoubtedly do want, at some point, a re-establishment of relations with the West. And that is another reason why looking forward they might be prepared to compromise. So it's not as if we don't have any cards to play at all, but they must be cards based on realities about understanding Russian capabilities, Russian intentions, the limits of our own strength, and also understanding what the other side might want. Some of the things they want, they might, if we think through them carefully, they might actually give us, if not exactly leverage, at least cards we can play with them.
Now, let me ask you this: keep it on the British side, public side, for just a moment. So, I played you that clip at the very top of the show where Keir Starmer is telling all the people in that hall there, and of course, by extension, all the people in the United Kingdom, that we can't let Russia win, because if we do, then all these horrible things are going to happen. Well, what if these things play out the way they appear they're going to, and there is a Russian victory by whatever means it turns out to be? Then how does he explain to if the UK freedoms and economic and stuff don't collapse, don't fall apart? How does he answer that? Or is it like, well, if a politician said it, no one's going to remember tomorrow what he said yesterday anyway? So how do you see that playing out in Britain?
Well, if he's thinking far enough ahead, which I very much doubt, by the way, that's probably what he says to himself. It's fine if I, go up to the Mansion House and make that speech, because tomorrow, in a year's time, when Ukraine's all gone and dusted, well, nobody will remember. And, the fact that it all turned out to be wrong, nobody will remember that either. But the reality is, of course, we shouldn't have a situation in which the Russian army just battles its way through to, the eastern border of NATO. That isn't in Russian interests. It's not in ours. Not for the reasons that Starmer says, because the Russians plan to march all the way to the Elbe or to Britain, or that they're going to put our values and our democracy and our freedom and all of that at risk. Nor is it because it's going to encourage all sorts of bad people around the world to do bad things. Bad people never require much encouragement to do bad things. That's always been my
Right.
It's because what we need to do is to achieve a long-term sustainable peace in Europe. And in order to do that, we need to talk to the Russians, and we need to come to an agreement with them. And it does need to be a long-term, sustainable agreement. And that means putting aside any idea that we can dictate terms, because quite obviously we cannot.
Yeah. So in closing here, where do you think this is going to go? So I literally, this is stuff from some today, some from the last couple of days, to where both in the United States and the United Kingdom, there's just a lot of disconnection from reality and a lot of claims that are just wildly out of touch with what's actually happening on the ground. Where do you see this going? And we'll say that from the time Trump gets in office.
Well, I think that we do have a difference in the administration, in the sense that the current administration has never been interested in discussions and negotiations with the Russians at all. It says, leave it all to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians must do it all by themselves. We're there to support them. It's in effect handing over American diplomacy to Zelensky and leaving him in charge of it, which is a crazy thing. At least this incoming administration says that they want to talk to the Russians, and they've appointed an envoy, who is General Kellogg. Now, what I hope is that Kellogg will go to Moscow. He'll meet with Zelensky. He'll meet with Putin. He'll meet with the Europeans. And out of that, over time, probably it will take quite a lot of time, some way forward that is more reality-based is going to come. In the meantime, the Russians have said very clearly what they're going to do. The Speaker of the upper house of the Russian parliament gave a very big interview yesterday. She's clearly well connected to Putin. And she said, look, we're waiting to see what the Trump people come up with. But in the meantime, we're going to continue with a special military operation. We can't do otherwise. We have no choice. We have no reason to assume that there is going to be peace simply because the new president says there is. But if he is interested in talking to us and talking to us sensibly, then we will talk to him. And out of that, if that is built upon, we might find a way through. A reduced Ukraine, obviously, but a Ukraine still, and peace in Europe.
I actually missed that. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I need to go check that out too. So at least we'll end on a positive note that there is hope that, especially when the new administration comes in, that maybe we can get to something that ends this war. It's just, I guess, just heartbreaking to know that between now and then, a whole lot more people are going to have to die when the end is already determined. It's just a matter of what it's going to look like. And gosh, it's so many, the history of wars, so many people die after the outcome is already known just because the politicians can't, come to grips. And it just grieves me to know that that's going to be the case here. But whatever we got to do to get this over, I'm all for it.
I agree. Completely agree.
But as always, a delight and a pleasure to have you on and have your great examples on of things you can bring to the table, things that we don't know about. So thank you very much for coming on again today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Daniel. It's always a great pleasure to come on your program, and I look forward to doing it again whenever you wish.
We always love it. Thank you very much. And thank you guys for joining with us today. Always a pleasure having you on there. We know that we don't get any of this stuff done without you, or there is no show if there's no people watching it. We've been very grateful to you. Also let you know we have another one of our fan faves on tomorrow, Colonel Doug McGregor, 2 p.m. tomorrow. And no telling what all he's going to bring to the table. He also brings stuff together that we don't know about from other sources, and I can't wait to share that with you tomorrow. Be sure and like and subscribe on the way out if you haven't, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.